Hey there, this is John from Heroes and Legends, and today is the first day of official Aether Revolt previews. We have a lot of cards to look at. I want to get things started quickly, but real fast before we do get started, if you check out the description below, there's a couple ways to help support us, one of which is the Amazon affiliate store. You can find some Aether Revolt products in there now, as well as many, many other things, but any purchases you make through any of those links, a small percentage will come back to help support the channel. And we also have links to our Patreon page, which is another great way to help us keep doing what we're doing. Having that out of the way, let's get into the cards. There's a lot to talk about. Now, these first two cards are cards we previously talked about, but have now been officially confirmed, so I do want to show those to you quickly. The first one is Pia's Revolution. This was one of the cards that was leaked a couple weeks ago, and we got the leak of the 4 story spotlight cards. This was one of them. So if you check out that video, it's in the playlist. You'll hear my full thoughts on this card, but since we've already discussed it, I'll just kind of move on. Next, we have Planar Bridge, and of course, this was spoiled about a week ago or so as an invention, so we talked about it at great length in the previous spoiler video, so check that one out for my thoughts. But this is the Aether Revolt version. I actually like the art better on this version than the invention, and I also like the flavor text and everything. This card actually looks really cool in its Aether Revolt form, to me anyway, but fantastic job on the art there, for sure. Alright, let's move on to some of the new cards, and we'll start off with All Admiral. This costs a white and 3. It's a human pilot, 3/1 with flying. Vehicles you control have flying. I would say this is a good limited card. It's very fragile at 1 toughness. But if I pay 4 for a 3/1 flyer unlimited, I don't hate that. And if I have a couple good vehicles where the extra evasion is going to make them better, then I'm very happy running this, I would say. I don't think it's going to do a whole lot beyond that. I mean, yes, you might want to throw this into a vehicles deck, but I think the really good vehicles decks are already running very powerful vehicles like Smuggler's Copter that don't necessarily need this. And the fact that this costs 4 to make happen just seems a little too much for like a standard environment, say. So good and limited, I don't really see it doing a whole lot beyond there. Next we have Decommission. This costs a white and 2. It's an instant, destroy target artifact or enchantment, and look, what do we have here but a new mechanic called Revolt. If a permanent you control left the battlefield this turn, then you'll get a bonus. That's basically what Revolt is. Now, this particular card, that bonus is you gain 3 life. So Revolt's pretty easy to understand. We'll talk about the mechanic a little bit first. It is in some ways similar to Morbid, except it's less constrictive, which is pretty cool. Morbid, if one of your creatures died, then at that point, if you played the spell or a creature, they would get a bonus effect because your creature died that turn. This time around, it could be any time a permanent you controlled left the battlefield. So that could be a creature dying, it could be a creature being exiled, it could be something sent back to the top of your library, it could be something returned to your hand, this could be something you sacrifice like a clue token. A couple other interesting applications for this could be things like clicker effects, and we saw a lot of those in the Kaladesh set, like Acrobatic Maneuver, for example. Another very interesting possibility, and we're going to talk about this a little more later with another one of the cards, is this works really well with fetch lands. So you start thinking that Revolt mechanic does have a lot of ways to turn it on, and that could be very interesting on the right card if it's powerful enough. So let's quickly talk about this card. I do think this will see some standard play out of sideboards. You have to remember you do have Fragmentize in the format, so that's going to take care of most of your threats, quite honestly, in a more efficient way. But as the meta evolves, and I'm sure we're going to see a lot more cards from Aether Revolt over the next week, there's potential that there may be some threats that are too high casting costs for Fragmentize to deal with. And if that's the case, it'll be nice to have this to take out of your sideboard to deal with those threats. So I do think at some point, anyway, it will see some play in that capacity. Sram Senior Edificer. This costs a white and 1. It's a legendary creature, Dwarf Advisor, 2/2. And whenever you cast an aura, equipment, or vehicle spell, draw a card. First off, this is another very playable dwarf. A lot of fans out there of dwarfs and that archetype are looking for these type of cards, so here's another one to contribute to that. Great if you're trying to build maybe a dwarf-themed commander deck, or maybe just like a dwarf sub-theme in your vehicle deck or something like that. It is a legendary creature, so there's pluses and minuses that go along with that. Of course, in standard, it's probably a minus most of the time because you can only have 1 in play at a time. However, in commander, this could be your commander, so that's a pretty big plus if that's the direction you want to go. I think in Standard, this is a card that could be sprinkled right now into current vehicles decks. They're already very powerful. They already do very well in the Standard meta. And here's a card that could slide right in and just give them a little more punch with some card draw ability. We've seen this time and time again in Magic. Whenever you have a 2 casting cost card with that much upside to it, you know what? It usually turns out to be a pretty good card. So I do think this could be Standard playable in those vehicles decks. Also, fantastic in Commander, like I said earlier. Could be a great commander for a lot of decks. And it synergizes really well with Pure Steel Paladin, which already sees play in Commander. As a matter of fact, there's even a Fringe Modern deck out there that focuses on Pure Steel Paladin. So who knows? Maybe this card can help make that deck into something a little bit stronger in that format. You never know, right? So yeah, there's a lot of possibilities for this card. I think this is a really great inclusion in the set to have another Legendary Dwarf. I think that's fantastic. Next we have Srams Expertise. It costs 2 white and 2. It's a sorcery. Create 3/1/1 colorless servo artifact creature tokens. You may cast a card with converted mana cost 3 or less from your hand without paying its mana cost. I love those type of effects. Now, this does cost 4. 2 of it's on color. However, if you can pull it off, you could get up to 7 mana worth of value out of this card. So not only are you playing this card, you're getting your 3 servo tokens, which could synergize with a whole lot of other stuff, but you're also playing something else for free. That's a big deal. Now, this card isn't as great if you top deck it, right? But as long as you have something in your hand that costs 3 or less, you're getting serious value out of this. One card that comes to mind automatically is Nissa Voice of Zendikar, and I kind of wonder, could a combo like that help to maybe springboard the green-white token style deck back into prominence into Standard? It's probably a little too early to say that, but we still have a lot more cards to look at from Aether Revolt. But I like this combo. I mean, I pay 4, I get my 3/1/1 tokens, I get to play Nissa for free, and then if I want to, I could automatically minus her, and my tokens are now 2/2s. Just feels like there's a lot of synergy there, and of course, that's just even ignoring her other abilities, which are also very good. So, potentially, could see some Standard play. I think it's a little too early to call, but you never know. It could get there. Shipwreck Moray. 1 blue and 3. This is a fish, 0/5, and when this enters the battlefield, you get 4 energy counters. Pay 1 energy, and this gets +2/-2 till end of turn. So, a couple interesting things to note here. We're seeing energy, so it's being confirmed now. Of course, energy will again be in Aether Revolt, which is good because energy is one of those mechanics that was brand new to Kaladesh. It's actually really fun, I think. It can be really powerful, but the big drawback of that mechanic is there's never been any energy cards before. So the power level of those cards are truly contained to what we've seen in Kaladesh. So Aether Revolt's going to bring a few more to us. Now, who knows when or if we'll even see this mechanic again in the future, but at least for right now, we know we're getting more cards to complement it. I think that's pretty cool. Having said that, this card in itself, I think, is a great limited card if you're going all in on the energy mechanic, right? And this is great in draft decks, but also even sealed decks. I've been able to hobble together good energy sealed decks, and I would love to have a card like this because first off, yes, it costs 4, but it gives me 4 energy. I mean, that's huge. If I have a big energy payout, no matter what that payout is, that's a big chunk of energy. Secondly, this protects me while I'm trying to build that energy bank or maybe buy time till I get to my payout. And that's very important too. And what I like, the ability of paying 1 to give this +2/-2, you can't fall asleep as an opponent with this card on the battlefield. Because even though, yes, it's meant to be a defensive card, and yes, it's primarily there to give you energy, at the same time, this thing could turn around and attack in as a 2/3 or even a 4/1 if necessary, and it's really going to make your opponent think twice about combat math in general. So I do like those type of cards quite a bit. I think it's probably not going to do a whole lot outside limited, of course, but I do think it's a really fair limited card. Whir of Invention. This one's interesting. Costs 3 blue and X. It's an instant. It has Improvise. That's another new mechanic. We did talk about that in length in a previous video, but real quickly, basically, if you have an artifact, each artifact you tap after you're done activating mana abilities pays for 1 generic mana. Search your library for an artifact card with converted mana cost X or less, put it onto the battlefield, then shuffle your library. So, very interesting. Now, the immediate comparison that might jump to mind to you is Court of Calling. Court of Calling, very, very powerful card. However, there's one big difference, and that is with Court of Calling, which has Convoke, I can tap a creature and get either a generic mana or a mana of that creature's color. So I can tap my green creatures to help pay for that 3 green cost. I can't do that with War of Invention. Improvise allows me to tap artifacts for generic mana, but there's no way to get colored mana out of them. So even if I tap a Torrential Gearhulk, for example, I can't take blue. I'm still getting a generic mana. That makes that 3 blue a lot steeper than the 3 green that you see in Court of Calling. So that's going to hold this card back quite a bit when you compare it to a card like Court of Calling. Having said that, though, I think the card's still pretty good. If you're in a real heavy blue build, maybe that's a control deck. I mean, imagine being able to pay the 3 blue, tap some artifacts or some extra lands you have around, and go and search up a Torrential Gearhulk, put that into play, go ahead and get something back from your graveyard to cast. There's just a lot happening in a turn like that, right? I will say this. I don't think this card is going to show up in standard play like in week 1 when you watch the Star City games open or anything like that. I think this is a card that's going to need a little bit of time for people to kind of figure out, kind of see the way the meta goes. I think the first few weeks you're going to see a lot of more aggressive style decks. But then as the meta wears on a little bit and folks start trying to play around with control, this could be a very nice piece or even a linchpin piece to a control deck. So keep an eye on it. Again, it depends on how the meta is going to go. It's going to have to be able to support a heavy blue deck. But if the meta does, this potentially could see some standard play. I do think there's some other interesting things to do with this card, though, in other formats. Commander immediately jumps to mind, and Lotus Bloom is a fantastic target for a card like this. And you see this interaction already with Wargate in Commander, but what I like about this is you can do it at instant speed for 3 on color mana as opposed to 3 different color mana, so I think it makes it a little bit easier to pull off. Another thing you could do maybe in Vintage is play this with Tolarian Academy. Now, granted, Academy is restricted to 1 in Vintage, so you won't always have that happening, but this can tap for a lot of mana. It does tap for blue mana, and there's a lot of amazing targets you can go and get in Vintage with this card. So I do think potentially I could see one of maybe in some Vintage decks. Alright, speaking of powerful cards, Fatal Push. This thing costs a black. It's an instant. Destroy target creature if it has converted mana cost 2 or less, and it has Revolt. And if you manage to get the Revolt trigger, destroy that creature if it has converted mana cost 4 or less instead. Okay, so we talked earlier about Revolt. We talked about some of the ways that you can exploit that a little bit, like flicker effects, and maybe most importantly when it comes to this card, fetch lands. Now, think about Modern for a moment. A lot of great targets are going to be 2 or less. I mean, you could hit things like Noble Hierarch, you could hit just almost anything in the Infect deck, right? Granted, it can't deal with things that are hexproof and stuff like that, sure, but this is going to deal with a lot of threats just right out of your hand without any other issues. If you have a fetch land you can activate, well, all of a sudden it deals with even larger threats. And honestly, you're not going to find a whole lot of things in Modern that cost more than 4 to cast, right? So this is going to take care of 99.9% of the threats that could potentially be out there. This is very powerful for 1 mana. Even if you do have to activate it in some situations to make it do what you want to do, the activation doesn't feel like it's super awkward or anything like that. This is also incredible for Standard. I mean, what's the most popular card right now in the Standard meta? Smuggler's Copter, right? This is an answer to that. That's awesome. This card is going to see tons of play in a lot of formats for some time to come. Night Market Arenado. This costs a black and 3. It's an Aetherborn Warrior with flying 2/2. And if you get the Revolt trigger, it will come into play with a +1/+1 counter on it. This is okay in limited. I'm not always going to put this in my main deck. It depends on what I'm trying to do. It's a nice sideboard card, though, if my opponent is all in on small flyers. And this is nice protection and just another card that can help me make the game a little longer. If I'm confident that I can get the Revolt most of the time, it becomes a little better. 3/3 flyer for 4 feels a little nicer, but you do have to jump through a hoop to get there. So it's not a card I'm always going to include in my build. It's going to depend heavily on the build. I could see myself sideboarding this in more than main decking it probably. Next we have Free Jam Regent, and this costs 2 red and 4. It's a dragon with improvise 4/4 flying, and it has pay a red and 1 to get +2/+0 until end of turn. So this is the dragon of the set, I guess. And I'm not real excited about this. I mean, it's fine and limited. And here's the thing for me. It costs 6. Granted, I can improvise and cheat this out a little earlier at times. but I'm still only getting a 4/4 flyer out of it. Like, if the base stats were higher, maybe if it was a 5/5 or 6/6, I'd be a little more interested. But even cheating out a 4/4 flyer earlier just doesn't feel good enough to me. Yes, it has the super fire breathing, but in some ways I almost rather have the option to just do the fire breathing for 1, even if it was only +1/+0, as opposed to having to put 2 mana into it to get that bonus. So it's going to be okay in limited for sure. I mean, you'll run it. You'll be happy to run a 4/4 flyer regardless, but it's probably not going to do a whole lot beyond that. Siege modification. This costs 2 red and 1. It's an enchantment aura, enchant creature or vehicle. As long as enchanted permanent is a vehicle, it's a creature in addition to its other types. Enchanted creature gets +3/+0 and has first strike. It's a powerful aura, but it's still an aura that's going to cost you 3/2 on color, and that's a pretty big commitment, considering if something happens to the card you put it on, you just got 2 for 1, and that's not going to feel good. So this will be restricted to the world of limited, but you're not always going to run this, quite honestly. I almost feel like this is a card that you should sideboard in if you're up against an opponent that you feel would be weak against it. Maybe they don't have a whole lot of removal or something like that. Main decking this does open you up to a 2-for-1, which could eventually lead to a game loss. Now, having said that, I get seduced by cards like this all the time because look at the thing. I mean, it's powerful. If you have a really good card to put this on, +3/+0 and first strike, you're going to want to run this. If you can drop this on even like a 2/2 creature on turn 3, like you're getting in for some serious damage, but it can backfire. I mean, it's high risk, high reward. It's certainly playable in limited, but it's not always going to be a card that's going to make your cut. Sweatworks Brawler, a red and 3 human artificer with improvise, menace, and it's a 3/3. Now this is very different from that previous card. Just giving it improvise is a big difference than what we saw from the 3/3 flyer. This is a hill giant with huge upside. So limited, I would play the 3/3 for 4 if that's all the card said and be happy with it a lot of the time, right? But the fact that I can perhaps play this cheaper, maybe even as cheap as 1 red mana, and it has menace, that's pretty awesome. I think this is strong enough to see standard play, and again, this is another card you could maybe sprinkle into vehicles decks. If you ever have a vehicle heavy draw and you're starting to fall behind, this card changes everything. You could tap those extra vehicles to get this out cheaper, and then you could perhaps crew something right away with it and just get in there for some damage. This card's actually pretty versatile and pretty cool. It's also good in aggro builds, I think. And again, the vehicles decks and the aggro decks that are Boros colors have been doing very well in standard, so it feels like this is a card that already has a home. Next, we have Greenbelt Rampager. This is an interesting one. It costs a green, it's an elephant, 3/4, and when this enters the battlefield, you pay 2 energy counters. If you can't, return Greenbelt Rampager to its owner's hand, and you get 1 energy. Alright, so aside from the fact that this is actually a good target for Dubious Challenge and Limited, which is kind of funny, there's a lot going on with this card. I do want to point out one thing first, though. The wording here. When Greenbelt Rampager enters the battlefield, pay 2 energy. If you can't, return it to your owner's hand and you get 1. So you can't use this as just a repetitive way to build energy. If at any time you have 2 energy in your bank, you have to use those 2 to keep it on the battlefield. So, okay, that idea is out the window as far as using this to just keep building your energy reserve for 1 mana. However, there's a lot of ways to siphon off your energy if that's what you're trying to do. I mean, we see a lot of creatures from the original Kaladesh that have that ability. They tap to attack. You can pay 2 energy to give them a +1/+1 counter, right? This actually combos really well with those type of creatures in a more beatdown style deck. Also, which is really interesting, is as long as you have 1 or 0 energy in your bank and you play this for 1 mana, not only do you get an energy, but you're also having a permanent you control leave the battlefield, which turns on Revolt. So this is a potential Revolt enabler as well, which is very, very interesting. And I'm anxious to see what other Revolt cards we're going to see this week that are in the set and how this could really be maximized to its full potential. Again, On its own, too, it's also a great beater. I mean, there's cards out there that you can get 2 energy on turn 1. You can play this on turn 2, and you got yourself a 3-4 on turn 2. There's a lot of power behind that, not only in limited, but potentially in standard. Again, we're going to have to see how the meta evolves. Will there be a beatdown deck that focuses on green? Maybe we'll get the pieces we need to really have that become a bigger thing in standard this time around. Who knows? So it's just something to watch for. I think there's a lot of potential behind this card. Okay, here's a card that plays really well with the previous one, Green Wheel Liberator. It costs a green and 1. It's an Elf Warrior 2/1. It has Revolt, and the Revolt trigger will give this 2+1/+1 counters when it enters the battlefield. So imagine on turn 2 playing the Elephant, it returns to your hand, you get an energy counter. On turn 3, you play the Elephant again, returns to your hand, get another energy counter. Play this for 2, you got yourself a 4/3. On turn 4, you replay the Elephant, pay the 2 energy, you got yourself a 3/4. Seems potentially like a good start to a big green deck, right? So these 2 cards on their own, probably not enough for it to get there. But depending on what we see that is coming, who knows? Maybe there's more really good pieces that synergize together. And this could potentially be a card that sees some standard play. A little too early to call at this point, I'd say, but I do find it intriguing if nothing else. Now, some folks have already begun comparing this to Tarmogoyf a little bit because of its low casting cost and high power and toughness potential. However, there's a big difference between a 4/3 and a 3/4, and namely, that's Lightning Bolt, right? Like, if you go through the trouble of getting this out as a 4/3 and it can be destroyed by a 1 casting cost instant spell, it's not going to feel real good. So I don't know if this will quite get there in Modern, but maybe this is a better card in Frontier. Definitely something to think about. Silk Weaver Elite. This costs a green and 2. It's an Elf Archer with Reach and Revolt. This time the Revolt trigger will let you draw a card, and it's a 2/2. So this is fine in limited. Reach creatures, I find, have been actually pretty good in Kaladesh limited in general because there are a lot of small flyers. So something like this could be a good card to sideboard in. And the Revolt's ability is just a nice little bonus when you can make it work. It's fantastic. I'm probably not main decking this most of the time, but against certain matchups, I would certainly board it in. Winding Constrictor. A black, a green. It's a snake, 2/3. If 1 or more counters would be placed on an artifact or creature you control, that many of those counters plus 1 are placed on that permanent instead. If you would get 1 or more counters, you get that many of those counters plus 1 instead. So first off, look at those stats. I mean, 2/3 for 2, even though it is 2 different colors. I like that. I mean, that's a great start to a creature. Secondly, the effect is pretty good, and it just is reliant on other things going on, so you do have to take that into account. I mean, it doesn't do anything on its own, but the effect is good with other things going on. That could be things like Fabricate or getting energy tokens, for example, and in both of those scenarios, this is going to enhance what you're getting from those cards, and that's fantastic. You also have to keep in mind that, yes, this works on counters for artifacts and creatures, so different types of charge counters. Of course, +1/+1 counters will work. Also, this is good for anything that's going to give you a counter. So energy counters work here, as well as experience counters in Commander. So that's kind of cool, right? The one thing that doesn't work, that's the big glaring omission here, of course, is loyalty counters. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Planeswalkers are powerful enough as it is, right? So this is very deliberate that that is not on this card. And that's a good thing, I think. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing here. This is a great card. Fantastic uncommon. I mean, you're getting a lot of value for 2. This doesn't fit into every deck, obviously, but I do think at some point someone will work this into a standard deck. I mean, maybe you could work it into Aetherworks Marvel if you worked at that a little bit. I don't know. But yes, this has power level to see standard play. This will be great for you in limited as long as you have enough enablers. I mean, it would be great in an energy deck. It would be great in a Fabricate deck. It just fits in a lot of places, so I think that's kind of cool. It's a really great card. I like the design a lot. And like I said before, also a good commander card. It's going to work with a lot of things. You'll find a lot of synergies there, including experience counters. Consulate Dreadknot. Here's an interesting one. It costs 1. It's an artifact vehicle. 7/11, crew 6. Very simple. Not a whole lot to say about it. It's cheap. I'll give it that. But that crew cost is extremely steep. Now, if you could somehow find a way to bypass that crew cost, this could become a playable card. More on that in just a second. Hold that thought. Foundry Assembler. Here's another improvised card. This one costs 5. Artifact Creature Assembly Worker. Improvised 3/3. Fine and limited. Maybe the most appealing factor in this card is the fact that it is an assembly worker. So if you happen to get yourself maybe a couple self-assemblers or something like that in your pool, then this card I think becomes a little bit better and allows you to restock your hand faster as you play these creatures. And if you're doing a draft, you can even create sort of that pseudo affinity style deck, and I think this card would be good in that type of deck. It's not going to always make your cut, just depends on what you're trying to do, but it does work really well with a lot of cards that are already in Kaladesh. Next we have Gonti's Aether Heart. This one costs 6. It's a mythic legendary artifact, and when this or another artifact enters the battlefield under your control, you get 2 energy. Pay 8 energy, exile this, take an extra turn after this one. Okay, first, right off the bat, I want to say this is the Professor's preview card from Tolarian Community College. If you haven't seen his preview card videos, they are amazing. I would go in there and watch them all because they are quite funny, and this one was awesome. It co-starred Boogie. They did a phenomenal job. I always love his videos when he previews a card, so check that out. Let's talk about the card itself. It is a little pricey. It's going to cost 6. And then you have to pay 8 energy to activate and exile it. So it's not reusable. So yes, it's asking for a lot of your resources, a lot of your time, but Time Walk is a very powerful effect. And if you have enough creatures on board, it just is the end of the game. I think there's too much variance here for standard. It's a little too pricey. It's asking a little too much. It's a little too slow for the current meta. But this is useful and limited for sure if I'm all in on energy. And you've probably played that deck if you played a lot of Kaladesh Limited at this point. And I've been able to put together really good energy decks, not only in draft, but also in sealed even. And sometimes you're just buying your time to get your payout. This is a really good payout. Maybe not as good as some of the others, perhaps not even as good as Aetherworks Marvel and those type of decks, but I still think it's a good payout and potentially could sometimes win you a game out of nowhere. And I wouldn't hesitate to run it, quite honestly. Another place where this card's really going to shine, obviously, is Commander, where you have more time and you have more mana and more resources available to you if you have an energy style commander deck. Of course, the Time Walk effect maybe not as powerful in multiplayer games, but towards the end of the game, if it's just down to you and your opponent, this could actually be quite good and could be a finisher for you. So there's definitely some good places to play the card for sure. Alright, next we have Metallic Mimic. This costs 2. It's an artifact creature shapeshifter, 2/1. When this enters the battlefield, choose a creature type. Metallic Mimic is the chosen type in addition to its other types. Each other creature you control of the chosen type enters the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter on it. Okay, so we haven't seen a large tribal element or anything like that in Kaladesh. So this card feels a little unusual at first glance. I mean, we saw some in Zendikar, and there was actually quite a bit in Innistrad block, but not so much in Kaladesh. However, what Kaladesh does have is tokens. A lot of servo tokens running around, some Thopter tokens running around. So this card does synergize well with those token strategies. Having said that, it's a little fragile. 1 toughness, it's really easy to get rid of, and on top of it, it's an artifact with lots of artifact hate going around. So it's not always going to last very long, but it does something interesting. I mean, it does play well with Fabricate and a lot of cards that are going to be making tokens for you. So it does have potential, and it's even better in multiples. It only costs 2, and if you put 2 of these down on the battlefield, all of a sudden you're getting a lot of power and toughness out of your tokens. So it could be an interesting token strategy. I mentioned earlier that maybe Selesnya tokens could be a thing in the future. Perhaps it's a Selesnya backbone to a servo token deck or something like that. Now, if the cards present themselves as we go further down the line with spoilers this week, then maybe that could be a thing in standard. Right now, I don't think all the pieces are there. It would take a lot more for a deck like that to get there. But this is a step in that direction. Outside of standard, yes, you could play this in commander, tribal decks, or in tokens decks, and this will be a fun card for you there. And you could get some decent power and toughness bonuses on your creatures for sure. Next, we have a card that comes to us from a Chinese simplified spoiler. It's Peacekeeper Colossus. It costs 3. It's an artifact vehicle, 6/6, crew 4. Oh, and by the way, you can pay 1 in white. Another target vehicle you control becomes an artifact creature until end of turn. Alright, so I promised you we would get back to Consulate Dreadknot. And here is a way to bypass that 6 crew cost. And all of a sudden, that card looks a lot better. Now, you do have to take this into account, though. It only costs 1. That's phenomenal. It's a 7/11. If you can get past the crew cost, it's a nice little beater, but it still doesn't have evasion. Now, if I'm able to play both of these cards, and maybe on turn 4, turn this thing into a 7/11, attack with it, it's pretty good. It does put my opponent on defense. They're going to have to go into chump block mode. The real problem, though, is these are 2 artifacts. There's a lot of artifact hate out there. There's a lot of ways to get rid of these cards, Fragmentize being one of the more prominent ones, but there's a lot of stuff out there, a lot of stuff that's going to come out of sideboards when they see you're playing this. And either of these on their own, at least in that example, aren't super great, right? If one of these goes away, you're either stuck with something you have to crew 6 or something you have to crew 4. It's not going to feel really good, and neither of them have evasion, even if you are able to crew them at that point. So I don't think there's a lot of substance behind that type of combo. I don't think that's going to quite get there in standard. Now, out of the 2 cards, I think I like Colossus a little bit better. I think that stands alone a little better in certain decks. For example, maybe I run a 1 of these in my vehicle deck, and if I get a little bit flooded on vehicles, I happen to draw this. Okay, now I can use mana to turn my vehicles on as opposed to the crew cost, and I keep myself alive until my deck kind of gets rolling, right? So there are some situations where I could see the Colossus doing some good things in standard. I think the Dreadnought is just a little too high variance, quite honestly. So Dreadnought potentially could see some play. Like I said, it could be sprinkled in some vehicles decks. Another interesting thing to think about when it comes to Colossus is the fact that Lupine Prototype's out there. Now, this has been a fan favorite card ever since it was printed. It has seen a little bit of success now in standard recently, and this is another card that could combo really well with a Colossus. Simply play this on turn 2. You got yourself a 5/5 that you can tap to turn the Colossus on the next turn. So imagine going turn 1 Dreadnought, turn 2 Prototype, turn 3 Colossus. On turn 4, not only could you crew the Colossus and attack in with a 6/6, but you could also hopefully pay the white and 1 to turn on your Dreadnought, which you played on turn 1. And here you are on turn 4 going in with a 6/6 and a 7/11. Doesn't seem bad, right? So, I don't know, there could be some potential there. Again, artifact hate is going to be an issue you're going to have to think about. And if a deck like that came to prominence, you know there would be a lot of artifact hate out there. So you do have to consider that. But potentially, maybe someone can brew something up with those cards that has some power behind it. Something to watch for sure. Finally, the last card of the day is Untethered Express. It costs 4. It's an artifact vehicle, 4/4 trample. When this attacks, you put a +1/+1 counter on it, and crew is 1. This is pretty powerful. Now, it does cost 4, a little bit of a mana commitment, but you know what? Paying 4 for a 4/4 trampler that's going to attack in the first time is a 5/5, and it's going to keep that counter. Next time it attacks, it's a 6/6, and the sugar on top here is it only costs 1 to crew. That's actually a pretty good beater. I like this card a lot, actually. It doesn't necessarily even have to be in a vehicles deck. This could fit into a lot of different decks. As long as you're comfortable crewing it for 1, that shouldn't be difficult. I think this could be a fantastic standard card. This might be one of those cards that crosses over, much like Smuggler's Copter, into a lot of different builds in the future. So keep an eye on this one. Obviously, goes without saying, this is a beater in limited. You'll be very happy to play it. And notice it's an uncommon. So limited games, you're going to see a couple of these floating around. That's actually pretty interesting in itself. So really cool card here. I like this one a lot. And having said that, those are the cards for today. Now we'll be back tomorrow with another video. Again, we'll compile all the cards from the next 24 hours and talk about them briefly. And then on Friday, we should get the full set and we'll begin our full set review as we always do. So until then, hey, thanks for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe and have a great day. Hey, thanks as always for watching. This video is made possible by the generous support of viewers like you on Patreon. Check out the description below for links to our Patreon page as well as our Amazon affiliate store, where a small percentage of all sales will also help support the channel. Finally, if you haven't had a chance yet to subscribe, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any new videos on Heroes and Legends. Talk to you again soon, and have a great day.